the importance of time frames in a real estate contract. Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta, and today's contract tip has to do with time frames in a real estate contract. All about different time frames and their importance and what to look at, what to put if you're working with a buyer, what to put if you're looking with a seller. So this is just a general discussion of time frames in a real estate contract. So I wrote a few notes so I don't forget anything, and let's get started. So the first thing is just a general concern. Contingencies. When you are negotiating a contract on behalf of a buyer or a seller and you are negotiating for a certain contingency, for example, a financing contingency, an appraisal contingency, contingent upon the buyer selling their current home, so the sale or lease contingency, what time frame should you put in there? Well, like everything, it's all negotiable and it depends upon the party whom you are representing. So if you are working with a buyer, you want as long a time frame, contingency time frame as possible. If you're working with a seller, you want as short a time frame, contingency time frame as possible. For example, on the sale or lease contingency, there's an option that that contingency, a seller accepts a buyer's contract contingent upon them selling their current home by, and there's an option where you can put in closing date, meaning the closing date of their current home or the contingency period coincides with the closing date of this contract for their new home. Great for a buyer, and you would want to do a back-to-back closing. If you're a seller, there's another fill in the blank for a where you can negotiate a different time frame. Might want to make that the buyer has to close on their home sooner so that you're not waiting until day of closing to find out if the deal's going to terminate and the buyer gets their earnest money back. So that's just general contingencies. What about the reference date? So whenever you're negotiating anything on all of our forms in the GAR contracts, Georgia Association of Realtors, and the RE forms, there is a place on the bottom to fill in either, if it's a contract, the binding agreement date or an acknowledgement date. You never want to leave that blank. Why? Because you're going to use that date to reference that document at a later point in the negotiations. Okay, Dana, you've lost me. What do you mean? Well, let's say, for example, that it's easy with a contract. Let's say you buyer and seller negotiate, you get a binding agreement date. Later you do an amendment where you're going to reference the contract with the binding agreement date of whatever that binding agreement date is. But it's a little more tricky, for example, if you are completing a brokerage agreement. Let's say you are completing a brokerage agreement and the brokerage agreement doesn't start until next week. So you have the commencement date of the brokerage agreement beginning at a date later in time. But at the bottom of the brokerage agreement, there has a fill in the blank for the acknowledgement date, the date that the public buyer, public seller acknowledges that they've signed this document. That would be, for example, today. Then let's say you have to do an amendment to your brokerage agreement. Well, what date do you put in there? You're going to reference the acknowledgement date, not the beginning date of the actual client relationship. What about days? Well, in the contract, if it just references days, if it just has the word day, that refers to a full 24-hour calendar day. So that would mean if it just says days, so many days from binding agreement date, that means that time frame goes through 11:59 p.m. on that day, regardless if it's a weekday, a weekend, or a holiday. If the contract says a banking day or a business day, that refers to still 11:59 p.m., but Monday through Friday, so no weekends and no federal holidays or banking holidays. Now, what about the time frame? Well, in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract, every time frame goes through 11:59 p.m. on whatever that day is. The only exception is, and this is just in the GAR contract, if one of the parties is going to use, and this is new for 2025, if one of the parties is going to use the 8-day unilateral extension for one of the prescribed reasons, that notice to extend the contract for 8 days, again, only a GAR provision, must be sent prior to 8 p.m. on the last contractual day of closing. So, easy way to remember this, 8 by 8. If you're binding in the GAR contract and you're going to use the 8-day unilateral notice to extend, you have to do it by 8. That is the only contractual time frame in terms of clock and hours in the contract, in the GAR contract, and that is new as of 2025. Again, 8 by 8. And two more. What about the counting? How do you even count days? Well, when you are counting contingency days or any time it references a number of days from either binding agreement date or the acknowledgement date, then the day that it begins, you start counting. That is day 0. So, for example, if you have, let's say you have a due diligence period of 5 days and you go binding today. Today is day 0. Why? Well, it's easy to think about it. Some parties will negotiate in the morning, and if you get a binding agreement date at 8 a.m., then if that were to count, then a buyer, let's say it's due diligence or whatever contingency, they would have an extra day. Some parties would negotiate and get something binding at 11 o'clock at night. So that's why the day that the agreement is signed, goes binding, the acknowledgement date, that day is day 0 for counting purposes. So 3 days. Today's day 0. Day 1 begins tomorrow. And the last one. In the GAR and in the RE forms purchase and sale agreements, the amendatory clause paragraph, that protection for a buyer's earnest money, if a buyer is getting a government insured loan, FHA or VA insured loan, and the amendatory clause is in essence the appraisal contingency, and that goes through day of closing. And what that means is if the value determined by FHA or VA comes in lower than contract price or what they had negotiated, the buyer has the right to terminate, get their earnest money back, and they have that right through day of closing, through 11:59, right, on the day of closing. And the amendatory clause paragraph cannot be special stipulated away. Parties cannot agree to modify that time frame. But the parties may agree to modify any of the other time frames. You can modify, you can put an end date on any of the contingency time frames. An end time. You could say due diligence ends at 6 p.m. on so many days after binding agreement date. Or you could reference that all these time frames are business or banking days rather than calendar days. Whatever the buyer and the seller agree to via negotiation, they can negotiate. All except for the amendatory clause paragraph. And that one cannot be amended away. So, I hope this contract tip on time frames and days and counting in a real estate contract helped you out. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks and Seema Sparks. Hi, Seema. Hi, Seema. Satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.